Are we live? Hey, we're live. Okay, so welcome to this month's Kids Club. This is for the September book. Is that right? Did I do that right? No, August. It's August. It is August. Very good. The August book. The August book is Kid Beowulf, and we are here. I'm Brian Hibbs, your host.
I'm Ben Hibbs, your co-host.
Your co-host, and we're here with Alexis Fajardo. Gosh darn it. I suck. Who is the writer and artist of Kid Beowulf, along with a very small audience of children this time, because we do this week after week. I think is why the audience is too much content at once. Yeah. So this was our book for the week, for the month. We loved it quite a bit. You guys like it? Was it good? Yeah. Oh, you have. Okay, you're just starting. Okay, all right. We'll try not to spoil it then. Very good. And you have a presentation. Do you want to go straight into that, or do you want to talk first?
I am malleable. The presentation is sort of part the part about what Kid Beowulf is, and then sort of my process stuff. So if there are artists here or in the internets who are interested, it kind of walks through that, and then maybe questions will be generated from that discussion. So,
sounds great.
Yeah.
Let's roll with that then.
Okay. Well, as Brian said, my name is Lex. I'm a cartoonist, and I do this thing called Kid Beowulf, which you guys have been reading. This is a shot of me in my studio. I actually live up in Santa Rosa, which is just like an hour north. And if you guys have been up that way, but there's, believe it or not, there are actually cartoonists up there too. But interesting factoid. Do I need to? Should I? I actually used to live right up the street. Here, I'll hand this back to you. And this used to be my local comic shop. So I would come in, check out the great books, and wish that one day my book would be among the shelves. And now it is. So it's a dream come true. This is my dog, Loki. He's a border collie. And when I am in my studio, he often joins me. And Loki, I don't know if you guys know, is the name of a Norse god. And it fits because thematically I love all those Norse stories. So you may have come across the name Loki in the book that you guys had just read. So my day job, as I said, I'm up in Santa Rosa. And in Santa Rosa, I don't know if you guys have been there, is the Charles M. Schulz Museum. Anybody been there or heard of it? Okay. It's a great place. If you haven't been, it's worth the trek. It's a beautiful museum that's devoted to the art of Charles M. Schulz, creator of Peanuts. And I don't work for the museum, but I work for the licensing office that is works in Sparky, which was Mr. Schultz's nickname, in his old studio. So there's a bullpen of us of like maybe 17. Some of us are artists, some of us are sculptors, some of us are accountants. And we basically work on the licensing for Peanuts. So anything that has Snoopy or Charlie Brown on it, whether it's a mug or a t-shirt or a book, goes through our office. We give it a thumbs up and make sure that it's done with the same amount of integrity and quality that Mr. Schultz would want. And one of my things that I was in charge of were creating this new line of comic books. I don't know if you guys have seen these. This is a graphic novel. It was actually in the shelf. It's called Where Beagles Dare. And it's an original story featuring Snoopy as the flying ace and the Peanuts gang. And this was published through Boom Studios. And I was the lead editor on the series, which means I didn't do any artwork myself, but I would find, I'll go back on, artists and writers who could write in Mr. Schultz's voice, and the artists who could draw the characters. And then we did that for about 5 years. The last monthly issue came out just last month. To do original graphic novels or not, we're kind of feeling that out right now. But it was really fun to work with Boom and find these different artists who do Peanuts. So that's my day job. And then at night, as I said, I go back home and I work on my own comics. And my stuff is a little different than the comic strips. As you can see, I like to do action, adventure, fantasy stuff. But the way I draw my characters, there is definitely that influence from comic strips. And I'll get into a little bit of that a little later about different comics that I like and draw inspiration from. So these are some other characters. You guys know who these guys are? This is the yeah. Are you guys fans of the new movies or the comics or anything? Yeah. So like you, I grew up reading these guys too. My favorite, Spider-Man, and I loved reading all those great tales. But the other kind of heroes that I really responded to were older heroes, folks like Theseus, who slayed the Minotaur, and Perseus, who killed Medusa, and Heracles, who had all his 12 labors going after monsters and whatnot. And my personal favorite was Odysseus. I don't know if you guys know Odysseus, but from the Odyssey, right? Really bad with directions. Took him a long time to get home, but great tale in the Odyssey. These guys are all Greek, and if you think about a world map, Greece is sort of in the southern part of the Mediterranean. And another hero who I liked a lot was actually up north, almost directly up north, from Scandinavia, and his name was Beowulf. Now, have you guys ever heard of Beowulf prior to seeing my book? Okay. How did you come across it? Was it in a movie or a book or a...
No, I just read these sort of myths and
Okay.
such.
So you and me were on the same page. Beowulf, like Theseus and Heracles and Perseus and even Odysseus to a certain degree, is a type of hero called a monster slayer, which means he's a guy who goes out, kills monsters, wins fame and fortune, and people talk about his deeds forevermore. This is the world that he comes from, which is, as I said, Scandinavia, kind of directly north from north into maybe to the left of Greece. And it's a harsher climate where Greece is sort of sunny and you've got the beaches of the Mediterranean. Up in Scandinavia, it's cold, it's harsh. And even that kind of environment, I think, blends into the type of stories that they tell. So oftentimes you get stories about Vikings and mead halls and gnarly, monsters, which is the story of Beowulf. This is one interpretation of Beowulf, probably the most well-known version of Beowulf, the big hulking Viking warrior. And the story is very straightforward. I actually did a prologue which retells the original story in the book that you guys have. But the basic beats are that, as I said, he's a warrior, and he goes across the lands of Jutland, which is modern-day Sweden, and Daneland, which is Denmark, slaying serpents, killing monsters. He gets word of a kingdom across the sea in Denmark, this castle Harrowt, which is being plagued by a man-eating monster day and night. This monster's name is Grendel. Nobody can defeat it. So Beowulf, being the hero that he is, he says, well, I'm going to take my guys and we're going to destroy this guy. So he goes across the sea with his 14 thanes, which are knights, and he confronts the man-eating monster named Grendel. And Beowulf is such an impressive hero that he decides he's not going to use a sword or a spear or a bow and arrow. He's going to fight Grendel mano a mano, so hand to hand. So that's what they do. For one long night in the mead hall, the great hall Harrowt, he and Grendel go at it, and they're pretty evenly matched. There's actually Grendel kills a couple of his thanes, but when he gets up against Beowulf, the match, sort of wrestling match, goes on for the entire night. And the only way, you guys have already eaten breakfast, right? Okay, the only way that he can actually defeat Grendel is by ripping his arm off. So he rips Grendel's arm off right from the sinews, and Grendel goes loping back to his swamp, and along the way he kind of bleeds to death and dies before he even gets there. Everybody in the castle Harrowt is totally stoked because the monster is gone, so they start to drink mead and shower Beowulf with gold and gifts. And then a couple nights later, another monster comes. This actually happens to be Grendel's mother. I don't know about you guys, but if I ever got my mother angry about something, she would be a terror. And that is Grendel's mother. She discovers she's been murdered by these folks. She is going to go back and wreak revenge. She actually doesn't have a name in the story. She's called the Sea Hag. And she is more monstrous and stronger than her son. So when Beowulf goes to confront her, he tracks her down to the swamp, this fire swamp. He goes all the way down to the bottom of the lake, and he finds her in this cavern where all these gold and jewels and weapons. And he tries to fight her with the sword that he brings, but it shatters across her back. And through that confrontation, she is really giving Beowulf a hard time until he finally finds this ancient sword tucked away in all the treasure. He lifts it because he is mighty that way, and he's able, with one swipe, he kills her. Then he decides, you know what, maybe I'm going to go home. There's a lot of monsters here. I've vanquished these two. I don't want to hang out and see if there are any more. So he packs up his ship, his remaining knights. King of the land gives him treasure, and he goes back home, and he stays king of Geatland for 50 years. No more monsters come because they know that Beowulf will come out to vanquish them. Until 50 years later, when he's an old king, he's sitting on his throne, and this dragon comes to threaten his homeland. And so Beowulf has to go out one more time. He puts on his armor. He's an aged old man, brings his sword, and he goes to defeat the dragon to save his people. And he actually does kill the dragon, but he also dies at the same time defeating the dragon. And that's basically the story of Beowulf. I had to read it in high school, and I read it as an epic poem form. So it wasn't a novelization. It wasn't sort of a graphic novel. It was just a translation of the original poem, which is what this looks like. This is a copy of the original. It's in Old English, and that's where our language comes from. And the one copy that's left is in the British Museum. So if you went to Britain, you'd actually see this under a pane of glass.
Oh, I saw that.
Yeah, have you seen it? And then if you see the edge here, see how it's kind of burned? We're really actually lucky that we have this, because the one copy that was made, originally it was just sort of sung around campfires. And then this nameless monk decided, you know what, I'm just gonna write this down because it's a good story. And the monk, because he was Christian, he sort of to throw in these Christian elements into the story. He kind of makes references to Cain and Abel, these other things. Beowulf is a very pagan story in the sense that there are gods and monsters, which in the Christian theology, there are none. So Beowulf is one of the part of the reason it's studied so often is because it's a mixing of these worlds. And this monk wrote it down. He didn't write his name on it, so there's no author credit. But the one copy that he made, it was in this guy's library in the 17th century, and the library caught fire. And that's why this is burned right here, because part of it, before it was saved from that fire, was getting singed. So, and these are some of the many information come across from translations that you read in school to movies. There are a couple movies based on Beowulf. DC Comix actually did a series in the 70s called Beowulf the Dragon Slayer. There's a great version by Gareth Hines, which is a sort of more of a straight up graphic novel narrative. And then there are even games. So it's a story that a lot of people have read and interpreted, been inspired by, like myself. So this is my version of Beowulf. He's not quite as heroic as the one we saw before. He's got the nub nose and the big monkey ears and a shock of orange hair. And this is my version of Grendel. Again, not quite as monstrous as the one we saw before. And in my story, as opposed to being arch enemies, they're actually twin brothers. So that's the big twist in Kid Beowulf. That book that you have is sort of the origin story of how and why these guys are related. Oh, I almost forgot. This is their pet pig. His name is Hama. And he travels with them on all their... He's kind of like R2D. He doesn't speak. He's very smart, but he gets them out of trouble. And this is the rest of the family. This is their mother, Gertrude. So in the original story, she was the mother that came to wreak revenge. She was just called the Sea Hag in the first. So I named her Gertrude. And I named her after another queen, princess from Denmark. Hamlet's mother is named Gertrude. So there's a little homage, Shakespearean homage there. And then this is their dad. His name is Edgetho. If you have the book, if you see the cover, see the guy with the torch? That's actually Edgetho. So something happens in the book. I won't tell you what. But he goes from being a human to being this sort of fiery ghost. And this is the dragon that Beowulf slays in the original epic is Beowulf and Grendel's great-grandfather. So the first story is basically a family song, and it has all these faraway lands, and it's got magic and big battle sequences and fiery dragons. Whenever I can throw in some humor, I will, because I like action and comedy at the same time. And you can see my style is very cartoony, so it sort of lends itself to fun stuff. This is the cover, which you guys are familiar with. So you can see the whole family right there. The two folks that are humans that are to the right of the dragon's wing, that is Beowulf and Grendel's grandparents. So the story starts with the guy in the purple shirt, and his name is Hrothgar. And all the events in that book that you're reading spring from his desire to marry this girl from an opposing clan, this clan that his clan is going to war with. And it kind of starts off like a lot of other mythological stories, like Helen of Troy. She was abducted, and that started the Trojan War. And then King Arthur's mother, Igraine, she was also someone who was abducted by this other prince, and then you end up having King Arthur. So in mythology, one of the themes, regrettably, is sort of the abduction of these powerful women, and then all the consequences that lead out of it. So that was one of the things I wanted to kind of weave into my story of Kid Beowulf. This is the world of Kid Beowulf. Doesn't look too different from our world. The names might be a little different, but can you guys recognize some of these spots? So you have Beowulf and Grendel come up from up here, which is Daneland and Geatland, like I said, Sweden and Denmark. And then there's Francia, which is France, and Hispania, which is Spain, Britannia, Britain. So this is the world that the brothers exist in. And the idea in my series is that they're going to travel to all these different countries. And what's really cool about world mythologies and epic poems is that every country has its own hero. So Beowulf and Grendel are going to go to those other countries, meet those heroes, and get into other adventures. So for instance, when they go to France, they're going to meet King Charlemagne. I don't know if you guys have heard of him, but he was a great Frankish king, and he was in charge of what is most of modern day Germany. He had these great knights that were called peers. They were kind of like the Avengers of France. And he was often at war with the king of Spain. So there's this great story called the Song of Roland, where Charlemagne and his knights, they do battle right at the border between France and Spain. And great hero Roland sacrifices himself for the kingdom. And there was a story that was built on that. So the second book in the Kid Beowulf series uses a lot of those characters. They'll also go to Spain, which is the home of the great hero El Cid. And then they'll also go into places like Greece, where there's the Iliad and the Odyssey, where our friend Odysseus is from. And further on to the great land of Uruk, which is modern day Iraq, where Gilgamesh comes from, who's actually the very first hero. His story was written down on clay tablets. So even before Beowulf and the scribe, there was a guy chipping away a story about Gilgamesh. And one day they get all the way to Japan, and along the way they'll meet all these heroes, get into other adventures, and they'll slowly grow up, and they'll discover that the destiny for Beowulf and Grendel is the origin story that I told you about them fighting. So it all leads back to the original Beowulf. And it's all about the brothers dealing with the fact that one day they may have to fight each other, and whether they will or they won't, kind of that embracing your destiny kind of thing. These are some covers for at least several of the books already in the series. Book 2 is the one I was just telling you about, which is The Song of Roland. And I'm in the midst of coloring that right now. Prior to the book that you have, I was self-publishing my books, so there were black and white versions. And I did the first 3 books in the trilogy, which is the third book is the one where they go to Spain. And currently I'm coloring them and getting them out to a wider audience. So book 2 will be out beginning of March next year. And that's a big action adventure swashbuckler. There are giants and elephants and roller coasters. And then book 3 is a little more romantic. They go into Spain and they meet Rodrigo, who will one day become El Cid. And he's got some girl troubles, and he also has to save a kingdom. So, the series has also been embraced by teachers and librarians who are big fans of all this classical literature. So I put together this handbook. Character dossiers and fun facts about the characters and what inspired me to draw them. Lesson plans, boring stuff. And people seem to like the book. It's been getting some good reviews. And in terms of other comics, I always tell folks, if they're thinking about reading Kid Beowulf, they might like it, like things like Usagi Yojimbo, which is a great epic about a samurai rabbit, or Jeff Smith's Bone. I don't know if you guys ever read Bone. And one of my all-time favorites is Asterix, which is a story that I read. It's from France, or actually you guys have some in the shelves. And it's a great action-adventure series from France. And also Amulet from Kazu Kibayushi. So other series that are similar to mine in terms of like world building and brand new characters and places to take them. So that's kind of the beginnings of Kid Beowulf. The second part is kind of the process stuff, like how I actually build a comic book page. So do you guys have any questions about the early bit? Okay. No, only if questions come and you get inspired, then you mention. If not, I keep going. You have to keep listening to me. So sorry either way. So this right here, this part is process stuff. So how I go about making a comic. So if you guys are aspiring writers and illustrators, some of this might be interesting to you. This right here is a model sheet. In animation, model sheets are actually used because you have so many different people, like for instance, creating The Simpsons, the animators need to know how to draw Bart in all the different ways, and Homer and all that. Because I'm a nerd and I'm a process junkie, which you'll find out, I decided to do a model sheet for Grendel, just for fun. So this kind of gives you some tips and tricks on how to draw him. In fact, he's got 3 toes and these weird patches on his body. I actually had sculpts made of each character, and I gave this to the sculptor, and they use this as reference. But for me, believe it or not, all the stories that I decided to write come from pre-existing stories. So when I decide to write a new story in the Kid Beowulf universe, the first place I go is the library. And I raid all the shelves for all the different stories, and I read I watch all the documentaries, and I'll go online and watch YouTube videos where these actually fight each other by the end of the story. So I changed the title. And this notebook actually has all these different ideas that I was hoping I could get to, but for whatever reason, as I was crafting the story, they didn't line up, or new ideas took the place of the old ones.
Here's a quick question.
Yeah.
There. So what percentage do you think of the ideas that you come up with in this initial process actually make it to the page?
Maybe, if I'm lucky, 70%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
A big high number, okay.
Just because structure is really important to me, so I need to understand when you're writing a story, is the crucial question is, what does your character want? And if you can identify those things for all the different characters, hopefully all those strands will start to weave together, and they'll get you to that final confrontation, or that climactic experience. One good tip for writing, at least that I've that I try and keep in my head is like knowing the ending, like knowing where you want your characters to end, especially in a series like this, because you have to get them to the next country, the next story in the book. So knowing how the book ends and then working backwards is also very helpful. But for instance, in terms of book 3, I wanted the final battle to take place at what is now the Alhambra, which is in southern Spain. It was this great kingdom built by the Moors.
Went there.
Have you been there?
Went there this summer.
Isn't it beautiful? Yeah, I went there a couple of years ago, and it's just amazing. And that's where I wanted the final battle to take place. But as I was writing the story, I realized, well, where my characters ended up in terms of geography, I couldn't get them there. At least not in a way that made sense in the story, like, because it's, geography and distance actually end up dictating a lot of things. So instead of having taken place at the Alhambra, which metaphorically was sort of the place that the Moors and it was sort of like an idealized place where the Moors lived. So Jews lived there, Christians lived there, Moors lived there. That was sort of the ideal that they were trying to preserve. So I moved it to Toledo, which is sort of in central Spain, if you guys have been there. But it also held those same metaphorical ideals of like all these different cultures living together in harmony. So that was a place they were defending. And that ended up being better for the story. So oftentimes, that's in it. That's what happens. But yeah, the sketchbook and the notes help, crystallize all those different ideas that may work or may not.
Yeah, because one of the things I always think it's good to point out to young people is it's okay to come up with ideas that you haven't, that you don't necessarily have a way to use them. It's okay to generate more stuff than because it may spark more ideas in the future or new directions to go in the story.
Yeah. And for instance, actually, in the book you guys have, there's this double-page spread in the early part of it where Hrothgar first meets the dragon. And you'll see it's got like a yellow background and like Kirby crackle all over it. And the dragon is kind of explaining the theme of Kid Beowulf. It's all about all the monsters of the world and how each of them has their own slayer. The one that's destined to slay them. So that monster will sort of be removed. So you guys have it right there. Yep. And he talks about, see the bloody severed hand and the eyeball. So the dragon is talking about, in that instance, Hrothgar's father, whose name is Scyld. And 30 years before Hrothgar ever meets the dragon, his father meets the dragon, and they have this confrontation. And that confrontation was the dragon sort of sensed something in this guy, and he knew that there was like, maybe this guy's my slayer, maybe he's not, but he ended up picking a fight with, and they had this big confrontation, and Scyld ended up losing his hand, and the dragon ended up losing his eye. That's why he has that sapphire of an eyeball, and that's all backstory. And it was a story I couldn't fit into the graphic novel there. But what I did is I ended up doing a short story that kind of explains that confrontation, and it's just like a little 40-page novella, so to speak. Yeah.
Why did Shield never mention the dragon to?
Because he was trying to protect his son. Yeah, because he had a sense of his son who was very ambitious, as you read, and I think he knew that if Hrothgar met the dragon, bad things might happen, and he was right. Yeah, but that's sort of one of those things, like Brian said, like it was just in the back of the sketchbook, and I was able to find time to rewrite it and create a new story. So the writing of the story, every cartoonist works differently, and if you've been to these, I'm sure you've seen how other folks create their stories. For me, once I have all those ideas down in the sketchbook, I then start to write it out like a script. So this is kind of a copy of what my script looks like. It's kind of like a screenplay, but instead of the format of a screenplay, I'm basically doing the format of a page. So this says 4-panel layout, and each paragraph I'm describing what's happening in the panel, what it looks like, who the characters are there, and what they're saying to each other. And then once I have the script, then I do these things called thumbnails, which is a very small image, very sketchy, very loose, but it's basically kind of telling me the blocking of the characters and who's gonna, a vague sense of what the environment is, whether or not I'm going to do a close-up or where the balloon panel, where the balloon is positioned in the panel. Once I have the thumbnails, which is actually really hard, believe it or not, even though you're just doing little sketches, the thumbnailing and the breaking down of a comic book page is actually very exhausting. Then I go to my drawing board, and I have 11 by 14 Bristol board, which is kind of like cardstock, and I start to pencil it out. And you'll notice that my pencils are blue. Do you guys have any idea why I might draw in blue?
Because it doesn't show up as much.
Yeah, I pencil everything in blue for a couple of reasons. It's a little, for me, it's a little cleaner than graphite, which is just a regular pencil, so it doesn't quite smudge. And when I go to my inks, and I ink everything with a variety of different pens, microns or Japanese brush pens. The blue, when I eventually scan in the page in the computer, will kind of just dissolve. So I don't have to spend my time erasing. And like I said before, I'm a process junkie, so I like to see the underdrawing underneath. And oftentimes I'll write myself notes as I'm drawing. For instance, not so many on this page, but like little sound effects, or if I need to fix something or reduce a size, I'll just write those things in the margin. So I don't so they still are there on the original art. One little thing interesting here. So if you notice the inks page, these two guys, Rothgar and Holger, are in this position. But if you look at the thumbnail, I actually had them reversed. And for whatever reason, when I was drawing the page, I decided to flip them so it would be easier for you to read and then flow into the next page. So things are always kind of changing when you're doing comics, and you can. And prior to this, like I said, the books were black and white. So I would do what's called halftone, and I would just sort of block in some areas. But now with the color, I think the book really kind of comes alive. And my colorist is great. He actually lives in the Philippines. I email him everything. I've never met him yet, but he's a great guy, and he does some great things with effects and mood, and he makes everything really pop off the page. So while he's coloring, I'm at home and I'm lettering. And I'm ballooning and I'm sound effecting. That's a verb. And you'll notice that the font that I use is actually a font that's built out of my handwriting. So there are some cartoonists who are really old school, and they'll write in the text right on that inked page. For me, it's a little easier in the editing process to do that in Photoshop. Plus, there are names like Rothgar and Schild and yours, and like, you know, I'm always misspelling things, so it's easier to edit when you can do it in Photoshop. And so that's sort of the process. And then through the miracle of unicorns and rainbows and printing presses, something happens. I send all my files off to my editor and publisher. They send them off to a far off place like China, and a few months later, the books arrive. I don't know how they do it, but they print them out. And this is actually a photo of the stack that I was signing for you guys earlier this month. And it's very exciting because they arrive on your doorstep and you're like, oh my gosh, now it's a book. And now everybody can read it. So it's pretty cool. And then it also exists, because we are in the 21st century, on iPads and tablets and iPhones. You can read it on the computer. One thing when you're doing comics these days, or anything, is you don't want to give anybody an excuse not to read your work. So you have to make it available in all these different formats. And then the other thing you have to do is you have to go and meet cool people like you, go to schools and libraries and chat it up and get people excited to check it out. Let's go to a lot of conventions. Have you guys ever been to comic conventions locally? There's some really good ones where you can meet folks like me or Raina Telgemeier or Jeff Smith, and they all go to these things. The last big one was Comic-Con International, which is down in San Diego. And I almost forgot. This summer I came out with this cool little mobile game. I have it on my computer. I'll show you guys. It's called Looking for Lingonberries. And this came about because this fellow who'd been reading my stuff online wanted to develop this game. So he had this template for a like a match-3 style game, and I built a short story around it that takes place right after the book that you read. So there's there are kind of two parts to the app. You can play the game. So we'll try a level here. This is a free download, by the way. So if you go to my website, it'll give you links to where to find it. But you know, all these different challenges and things take place in the app. See if I can get something cool to pop up. But throughout it, you're looking for lingonberries, and lingonberries are kind of like cranberries, but they come from Sweden, and it's the thing that Beowulf loves the most, and it's the thing that throughout the series of the books gets him into the most trouble. Because when he gets hungry, he gets stupid, and he goes looking for lingonberries, and things happen. So there's like a little gem bomb. So you go through this, and as you no. So the orientation is off. But you can see here. You just go through screen by screen, and you can read it. It's built for phones, so that's why it's a little tiny, or that's why it's one panel per screen. But yeah, you can check it out. Go to my website, free download, and get a little adventure. And then the other place that you can get Kid Beowulf is 4 days a week on Go Comix. I don't know if you guys read comics online, but there's that's where I share the book. And right now it's in the middle of book 2, so you can get a sneak peek of book 2 where they go to France and meet Charlemagne and all that stuff. But yeah, that's kind of my spiel.
Oh, you got a question?
Yeah. So what gave you the idea to do like a whole world building type thing rather than just a standalone sort of?
So for me, I love comics that have the world building component to it. So as I mentioned before, things like Bone, where he took the time to really craft this really almost novel. And I think actually when I was about your age, the first comic I read was Asterix, and that's very much about world building. And about a similar time period, in this case, it was sort of Gaul, which is another name for France, and they're fighting the Romans. That is always, I was always gravitated to that. So, and reading the first book, it takes about 200 pages. And by the end of it, you know, we're just introduced to Beowulf and Grendel. They come in to like 120 pages. So the rest of the series is really about their adventures. So that's where the world building comes in. I think it's fun to just come up with new characters and new landscapes, and that's the challenge for each new book. Because every new country, I have to come up with new characters, new settings. It's fun. The challenge is by the time I get to the end of that, like for instance, the end of book 2, by the time I got done with that, I was really comfortable with the characters, what they look like. I'm like, oh, I want to hang out with these guys and do more adventures. And then I have to go on to book 3 and create a whole new cast. So I want to call it a problem. It's kind of a fun problem to have because then I've established the world, then I can go back and play with them in other short stories and whatnot. So, but I'm really into like just creating a whole Kid B universe, and it's a lot of fun. So,
We have at least one question from the internet here. This is from Keegan. And Keegan asks, how long did you spend writing the book? And maybe we can talk a little too about, how much you spend with each step of that process.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, so Kid Beowulf has existed in my brain and in the world for, believe it or not, 16 years. It first started as a zine, which is like a small digest-sized comic. It was black and white. At that point, I was just drawing it, and I had a friend of mine who was doing some of the writing. And then he was really bad with deadlines, so then I just took it over. And then that zine turned into a 200-page graphic novel, different from the one you guys have. It was sort of a first draft, basically, and I would use that. I would self-publish it. I would take it to shows, and that was sort of the template for when I found a publisher to do this version. And the version you guys have existed first as black and white, and it came out in 2008, and so that existed for a time, and I was with that publisher until the recession gobbled them up, and so then I was back to self-publishing. So it's had a really long existence, and throughout all that time, even to this edition you have now, I've been editing it and fine-tuning it and then coloring it. So it's a long road to get it to the way you guys have it, and I don't know what the advice is there. Is just be really stubborn, and if you believe in your work, hopefully other people will too. But each different stage has its own challenges. The writing is really, it's always, the stage you're in is always the hardest at that moment. So when I'm writing, it's just hard to get all the words on the page. But at least when I'm writing, sky's the limit. I can have 50 horsemen on the horizon that are going to come and fight Beowulf and Grendel. And then when I get to the thumbnail stage, that's really challenging, because then it's like, well, I have to draw those 50 horsemen. Do I want that many there? So you kind of maybe whittle it down to maybe 25. And then you get to the penciling stage. I'm like, oh man, okay. Maybe it's 15. 15, that's a lot of guys he's got to fight, right? So I finally scratch it out on the page. And penciling a page takes maybe an hour and a half. I'm getting a little faster. But it's also pretty rough. For me, the fun is
layouts. It takes about an hour and a half, or actually penciling it out.
I think a pencil page, depending on how many panels. If it's like most of my panels are maybe 6 to 7 panels, sometimes maybe 9, depending on how intricate it is. And I don't use a lot of the storytelling. For me is fairly traditional. I mean, I'm not doing lots of crazy layouts. But depending on the number of characters, yeah, I would say at the most maybe 2 hours to pencil.
Wow, that's really fast.
Oh, that's good to hear. It doesn't feel like it is.
I mean, a lot of people will tell us it takes
Like a day.
a full day, or
Yeah.
even 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
Someone like Craig Thompson, I think, was like, yeah, it takes me 2 or 3 days a page. So.
Yeah. Well, he's also very intricate.
Yeah.
So again, that's sort of choosing the style that works for you best. Mine is a little more open. It's kind of the Bigfoot style, so to speak, of European comics. The inking is my favorite part. So that will take, for a pencil page, maybe another couple hours. But I don't do a lot of cross hatching. I keep it open, especially now that I know it's going to be colored. I don't have to necessarily spot blacks the same way. So, and inking is great because you can get into like a Zen-like space and just, put on some podcasts or documentaries and listen. So, for instance, the story I'm working on now, which is actually a short story that deals with some of the characters in the second book, I was penciling. I got 2.5 pages penciled the other day, which felt okay, but really I want to do at least 5 penciled pages a day if I can, because the day job takes away from time. So weekends are really when I'm just sort of at the drawing board trying to get as much done, much to the consternation of my wife and my dog. So, but they're very understanding. And then the coloring is great because I'm not doing it, so I just send the book, I just send it off. And then I'm working on the text, and one thing I've noticed is that when I do my scripts, I tend to overwrite. So what I really like is when I get to the final part of putting in the text and the dialogue, I'm just paring away. I want to be, I'm kind of refining jokes, and I'm refining the story. And if I've done a good job, then you can kind of sense what the characters, how their moods and attitudes are just through through the graphics. So, and that's the beauty of comics, is you're kind of melding all that together. But every, I send my pages off to my colorist, and a couple weeks later he'll send me back the pages. Right? It's like Christmas. So, yeah.
Do any of you guys in the audience have any questions, thoughts, recipes for sandwiches? No. Okay.
I have one final thing.
Okay.
It's not a sandwich recipe, but in the Looking for Lincolnberry games, there are some recipes for Lincolnberry jam, and so some fun unlocks. So this right here is a trailer that I'm going to show you guys. It's a fun little.
How did you make that?
So I made that with a friend of mine who's much more talented than me, and he used things like Illustrator and Blender and Photoshop, and I did a storyboard, and I found the piece of music, and we just kind of put it together. And then I have a whole series of trailers that you can find on my YouTube channel or my website. And it's another fun way to kind of play with the artwork and get people excited about the book.
So you say you have so far 3 books in
Yes. Yeah.
set, and then it looked like you had at least 1 or 2 more ideas for based upon your map. And
Oh yeah. No, I have ideas for the whole series. In my crazy brain, there are going to be 12 of these things.
well, that was what my question was going to be.
Yeah.
12.
Book 4 is rattling around on my brain right now, and that one takes them to Italy, and they meet another pair of twins, Romulus and Remus.
Oh, nice.
So it's sort of the founding of Rome, and then from there they'll go into Greece, and there'll be 2 books in Greece, partly inspired by the Iliad, partly inspired by the Odyssey.
Right.
The second trilogy is the first trilogy is all about the brothers being together, discovering their brothers and going on adventures. The second trilogy is all about them being apart and trying to come back together. And while they're apart, Grendel sort of, as they get deeper into the places where monsters exist, Grendel realizes he's fairly civilized here, that he has these monstrous tendencies. And Beowulf discovers he's got this knack for killing monsters. Right. So I'm kind of weaving in that theme of that confrontation, and it's all about them when they come back together in book 8, kind of realizing that there's this kind of tension there. And as they go through all these different mythologies, I keep hammering in that theme. When they get out to Japan and China, where dragons are, because Grendel has dragon blood, and the Eastern version of the dragon is sort of a benevolent creature that brings hope and joy, whereas the Western dragon is sort of an evil creature. So the further east they get, the more of those benevolent things kind of flow into Grendel. He's in a way, he's almost, and I don't mean this to diminish the people who suffer from bipolar, but Grendel has that tendency to, and that's what he's kind of dealing with, is these highs and these lows. And his brother Beowulf deals with that too. So yeah, these are all sort of tucked away in my brain, and I hope that I can get to them. So yeah. So 12, I think. Yeah. And they'll eventually come all the way back home to, and they'll go off on a story to Britain, and then eventually to Iceland. I feel like this last story is going to deal with Ragnarok in a way, maybe. So, yeah.
Thor cameo.
So
Maybe, yeah.
So, do you have any problem? Because my memory, at least, and it's been a long time since I've read a lot of this mythology.
Mm-hmm.
But my memory is that these mythologies are not contemporaneous.
Mm-hmm.
That's the word, right? Where they happen at the same time.
Right.
Yeah. So you have to massage some of the times here. Is that?
For instance, like it is, but I don't think about it too much. Okay, for instance, Beowulf takes place in circa 500-600, and then the second book takes place with Charlemagne's reign, which is in the late 700s. So there's like a 200-year gap there, and then on top of that, the events of book 3 take them to Spain, where it's the 1000s. Right. For sticklers of continuity, that can be a real challenge. For me, I kind of feel like every country they're going into, they're sort of at that country's golden epic age. So it's not like they go through a portal or they're magically transported. They're just crossing into a border, and these heroes happen to exist there, and they're interacting with them. That's how I rationalize it in my head. And I think actually El Cid, that time frame of being in the 1000s, is as late as I'll get. And actually, as I go further into these mythologies, I'll go sort of back even before Beowulf. But again, they sort of exist, and they're moving through these different mythologies and timelines. And the Strand is the connective tissue of world mythology.
Sure. We can always just say it happens during heroic time.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Sort of like the Conan.
Yeah. Exactly.
Idea.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Very good. So, any other questions from the room? Because I think we're almost out of time here. Nothing. No.
Well, if you'd like, I have some bookmarks and then some flyers that will give you information about that game. You can check it out, download it. But I appreciate all the time. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, we appreciate it too. I also want to tell everybody that next month's book is Ghosts by Raina Telgemeier. And Raina is going to be here in person on Saturday. So not our normal Sunday, but it's Saturday, October 29th. And I think that's going to be we're going to have a lot of people here for that one, I think. So, what?
My birthday's so soon.
Your birthday is soon, son.
I didn't even know.
Why are we talking about your birthday? So thank you all for coming out, especially 2 weeks in a row like this. You know, normally it doesn't happen like that. Normally there's a month between, but thank you very much. And thank you, Lex, for coming out. We very much appreciate it.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Cool. Thanks.